What is leadership and what is it not? If you've ever been on a leadership program, you might have been asked to think about this question, but how would you answer it today? In a world of constant change, what kind of leadership do we really need? Is it about authority or influence? Is it about having all of the answers? Or is it about asking the right questions? My guest today is Mike Kennedy, and he's here to help us explore these ideas through a practical lens of stop, start, continue. What should leaders stop doing because it holds people back? What should they start doing to spark motivation and innovation? And what timeless behaviours should continue to anchor great leadership? So whether you're leading a global organisation or a small project, whether you feel confident in the leadership around you or are craving better direction, this conversation will hopefully spark some ideas and challenge assumptions. So let's get started. Mike, welcome to In Good Company. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you, Dan. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate that you can give us some of your time today.
It's my pleasure.
Let's give our audience the chance to get to know you a little bit better first. So why don't you introduce yourself in 60 seconds?
Okay, so in addition to being a husband, father, dog owner, amateur cook, very amateur guitar player, and geek about rock music, comedy, and baseball, I am Senior Vice President of Leadership and Management Development for IPG Media Brands, which is one of the 4 large holding companies in the advertising space. For the last 4 years, I've been responsible for setting and implementing a global strategy to help our people managers and executives fulfill their potential as leaders. Before joining Media Brands, I did this kind of work for clients as a freelancer for a couple of years after spending almost 8 years at the National Basketball Association as head of learning and leadership development there. Overall, I've been in learning and development for 30 years now after pivoting from my original career path as a psychotherapist. And I would say that that background is very much present in my approach to leadership development, which may come out somewhat in the discussion. So I'll leave it there for now.
Well, yes, I will absolutely be tapping into your wealth of experience of your career. So I'm very much excited to do that. And who knows, maybe at some point we might just get you to do a quick ballad on the guitar as well whilst we're at it. Or simultaneously cook something up. That's it. Yeah, that'd be great. Okay, well, let's get straight into it then. So we mentioned in the intro about looking at a sort of a lens of stop, start, continue. So let's start with some of the stops. What's one leadership myth or outdated practice you think we should stop believing?
Yeah, so if you'll indulge me, I'll frame that through the lens of a question that I've gotten a lot over the years, which is the question of, are great leaders born or made? And, pretty early on, and it's really been, I would say, between 12 and 15 years that leadership has really been my intensive focus. And pretty early on, I realized that was sort of the wrong question, but it took me a little while to realize the biggest reasons that it's the wrong question. And the biggest one is that whichever one of those you choose, you're still implying that being a leader is about who you are rather than what you do, right? That it's based on traits rather than behavior, for one thing. And also that there's something we can just point to and say, well, that's good leadership, right? As if it doesn't depend on the situation that you're in, or most importantly, the needs of the people whom you're meant to be leading, right? And by the way, there are things we can point to as bad leadership. The researcher and Professor Barbara Kellerman says that the 3 things we forget to account for when we design leadership programs are context, followers, and both of those are tough to weave in, but then also shining a light on bad leadership, which is not as tough to weave in, but it's something that's very often overlooked. So I do just come back though to the idea that there is a thing called leadership. Or there is a type of person who is a leader, and again, it just detracts from the reality being leadership is hard, and one of the reasons anyway that it's hard is that it's dynamic, and you're always part of being a leader is that you're always earning permission to lead, right? And that's what earns you that permission is it can't be predicted in every situation, right? So it's always about just increasing the odds that you'll behave in the ways that meet the needs, right? That leadership is there to meet first and foremost.
I think that's it. Is that and anybody that has worked with impact in the past will know this already. That our stance on leadership is looking at leadership instead of rather than a special type of person is action. Leadership as action is a great way of reframing what leadership is and should be. And I think you've kind of really hit the nail on the head there about it's not just about a list of traits and characteristics of a person, that it can be, and it can absolutely be learned behavior and how you show up and giving space and all those kinds of things as well.
Yeah, and even when you see, like, sorry to interrupt, but if you think about,
please do.
A close friend of mine in the professional sense, Matt Richter, who's president of TIAGI and very esteemed member of this community. Matt uses Winston Churchill as an example of someone who was not respected as a leader. And wasn't very successful at it right up until the moment that his particular approach to leadership became very important, right? And but then after the World War ended, his leadership style was then again became misaligned to the situation. So he may be regarded as a great leader, but he was not a particularly flexible one. He just happened to end up in a situation where the type of leadership that he naturally adopted was the quote unquote right within context. But I don't think history would have judged him as a particularly good leader had those circumstances not emerged. And it's so much based on context, on situation, and we just overlook that so easily.
So it's so true. So in your opinion, then, so speaking, we touched on the fact that we can learn leadership through programs. What would you say, and sticking to the as part of the stop theme, what would you say is a pitfall that you see in leadership program design that organizations should stop repeating?
Yeah, and this one's tough on some level because this is hard to do, but there is a lack of measurement, or at least having a measurement plan or some kind of evaluation plan in place when you set out on the road. Listen, the industry at this point, the last estimate I saw is that about $100 billion US dollars worldwide are spent on leadership development, right? And so much of that is done without having a concrete, and again, this comes back to context as well, right? I was saying recently to a group of colleagues that if the organization finds that teaching people to juggle will help us be more profitable, then our job is to teach people to juggle, right? And then the thing we should be measured on, because the company said that this is how we can be profitable. So what leadership development or learning and development should then be measured on is how well did we do teaching people to juggle, right? But so often there's just a disconnect of, again, just quote unquote make people better leaders, and without doing the work, the needs analysis work of understanding, well, what is it that we're hoping to achieve? What is that quote unquote leadership going to do for us? How can we measure what it does for us? And I've told my team many times, it's not that we're necessarily going to measure everything, but we should have a plan to do that, right? If someone comes to us and says, what's the thing that we would expect to see? What's the outcome? What's the behavior change that we can measure? We need to have an answer for that, right? And so it just very historically, and I've certainly fallen into this trap over the years. The idea that we can just go in with something more ambiguous, and as opposed to starting with the end in mind, and the end in mind that's connected to the context of the business, to the things that we're trying to achieve as a business that we know these skills will contribute to.
It can often be a bit of a pitfall of off the shelf kind of non-tailored solutions as well. I find is that because you feel that because it feels like there's no flexibility, and also it's that context that you talked about. The context has to be adaptable and changes, as we mentioned in the intro. It changes constant, and so without doing the evaluation, and you can't learn from the program itself. So if you're just delivering what you think is right, then you're not necessarily going to get the results that you want, unless you're listening to the people that are going through it.
It's never ceased to amaze me the extent to which there's a willingness for people to adopt or sell or just solutions that don't take that into account. And listen, I have used off the shelf programs, or at least adapted off the shelf programs, and it's not that they can't be useful, but there should be. It should be moving in one direction, right? It should be in the direction of here's the need we have, and we find a product that happens through whatever happy serendipity. That product happens to have objectives that line up with what we're trying to do. The mistake is working backward from, here's a program that sounds really great, and well, these objectives can retrofit to what we're trying to do. Probably not.
Yeah. And that's it. And I think that it goes back to that, what you said before, that context, because you're right. An off-the-shelf program might be perfectly correct for certain contexts and certain situations, but again, that would need to be in some way adaptable. And the only way you're going to be able to adapt that is by learning from it and doing the evaluation plans, I would think. Yeah. No, it's fascinating. So in terms of, let's looking at things that we should start doing then. So if we want leadership teams to strengthen alignment and collaboration globally, what would be the one thing that leaders should start doing to make team effectiveness a reality?
So team effectiveness, we've spent a lot of time thinking about team effectiveness, and there's some very, very strong data out there that suggests that, especially when you're looking at the executive team level, right, that team effectiveness is overlooked as a predictor of success for an organization. And without going into the weeds too much on that, I've made the case actually that a lot of or a certain amount of the investment that we make in executive development, which often tends to be very individually oriented, things like executive coaching, but that some of that investment would in fact be better moved over into team effectiveness, into helping executive leadership teams work more effectively together, collaborate together, everything that you said, Dan. And maybe the biggest, a couple of the big pieces that I've learned from others on this, the industrial psychologist Gordon Curfey talks a lot about the idea that we don't necessarily differentiate between groups and teams, and the short version of how to make that distinction is, are people working toward the same goals, right? And my experience is that goals in general are a real blind spot for leaders and for teams. And the quality of goal setting, the consistency of goal setting, consistency of coming back to goals and checking progress against goals. Those are big predictors of success, but common sense is often not common practice, right? And so some of that for teams just is are we consistently coming back to the question of what are our goals, and in fact, even we might not be a quote unquote team. We might not have the same set of goals, and therefore we might be more of a group, right? What does that mean for us? But if we do have shared goals, what are we doing to make sure that we're all pulling in the same direction? And that sounds so basic. And what I've again, learned over the years to a shocking extent is how little those basics are actually being executed, including at very senior levels. And between that and some strategy tools, again, I'm always a little bit taken aback when I go into a room of senior leaders and share some fairly foundational strategic framework exercises and say who's familiar with stakeholder mapping, or who's familiar with the pre-mortem approach. And I see a lot of blank stares, and it's a shame for people to get into these senior positions without having been exposed to them. That's not their fault, but it does feel like another area that we have work to do.
And with that particular example in mind, then, like what is the first thing that happens in that situation? I mean, in terms of, when you see that sea of blank faces, what's the next step? Like, what is it that you do to change that?
Oh boy. Well, one of the toughest things about leadership development as a learning area of practice, I think I'm of the opinion, at least from what I've seen, leadership and sales are the two big areas that really have this challenge to overcome, is that there's a real need for unlearning, right? That people have been reinforced or have felt that what they've done has made them successful, or they've learned from someone along the way. And listen, you can understand why. It's very hard to be confronted with the idea that what you're doing as a leader is not necessarily the best predictor of success as a leader, right? And so there's a real emotional challenge to overcome there. And so that's where the human touch, I think, is really essential. I am reminded of an exercise. I imagine it's very comparable to some of the ones that you all do, but that I think you have to prompt people to see how thinking differently could be to their benefit and the benefit of their teams, right? Where they have to be confronted. And there are a few different exercises or activities that I like to do, but I'm thinking of a particular game that that's great, because the more senior the audience, the more poorly they tend to perform at this game. And it is all because of Marshall Goldsmith writes about this quite a bit as well, the goal obsession, and how that becomes much more problematic as you become more senior and more experienced as a leader, right? But goal obsession, not in the collaborative sense, like very siloed goal obsession, and that obviously is a huge barrier to successful collaboration. But there needs to be some that needs to be put right in front of people. They need to see for themselves the ways in which their lack of collaboration, or their lack of maybe a better way to put it is their tendency toward competition becomes, I mean, and it really is, it's the great irony that we become, as Goldsmith has written, more goal obsessed, more narrow in our field of vision as we become more responsible for enterprise leadership, or the success of the enterprise. And so it's I don't know. I don't think I've seen a good bit of really deep research on the results of that, but I will say, just anecdotally and from observation, that's a huge pitfall for organizations. And I've been around several of them, but that just siloing, the only way to break through it is for people to have some experience that establishes the damage that it's doing.
I was really interested to hear what you were saying about the human touch, and it made me think, and this could be a bit of a wormhole here, but particularly with the rapid pace of AI integration, where, will that human touch start to disappear if it hasn't already? And when that gets recognized, particularly, I mean, we're seeing more and AI technologies in the learning and development space for sure, and it'll be really interesting to see how that plays a part But yeah, it's a big topic.
It is. I mean, I will say, yeah, quite a wormhole, right? But a pretty good one. The thing is, and we'll see, this obviously may evolve. People, the way we interact with technology can evolve and evolve quickly. What I think about though is the sense of accountability that we have towards others that we don't have toward a non-human other, right? And that's, I think that's the thing that's missing. You think about, when your car gives you feedback because you need to fill the gas tank, you get the ding from the car, and whatever, you go fill the gas tank, but you probably don't learn anything. This is a very blunt example, but as opposed to if your partner is sitting next to you in the car and is like, "Hey, you're low on gas, buddy," and that feels different, right? It's the same thing content wise, but it feels different. And when things feel different, they are much more likely to promote behavior change over time. In other words, you learn from those experiences more readily. And I think that's the piece that is, I'm using the word accountability. Another word, it's, might just be embarrassment, where, when I'm coaching someone and I've set a couple of goals for them between now and our next session, I mean, part of what drives that accountability toward those goals is the social pressure of it, right? The sense of embarrassment if I don't do that. And I don't think people are going to feel that, at least in the short term. I personally wouldn't feel it as much with an AI coach as with a human coach. And I think that dynamic is part of what we will grapple with. But for now, I would say that it's why social learning is one of the 5 or 6 primary forces that really promotes retention and application over time, right? And I don't think there's such a thing as social learning yet, or in the next few years anyway, with AI, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't be the person to answer that myself.
Fair enough.
But yeah, I mean, again, I was just reflecting what you were saying there. Like even this conversation, there would be a totally different feeling if you were sat here in the room with me. Even this, just by going through a computer, it's amazing what you were saying about that's something you just can't, even just like we're a human talking to another human, but there's still technology in the way of it feeling completely different, and we've often found that on programs as well, is that, what one has been a challenge for us. And in many ways, I think we've accomplished this, but there's still nothing quite like that. There's definitely a difference between a face-to-face learning environment where we're all in the same room versus being on a screen where you're looking at everybody this size or smaller, or and then of course there's email notifications and other factors distracting you. But there's the feeling element, I think, is quite interesting, which I've not really thought about before.
It's funny. Before this technology became so prevalent, or at least prevalently used, right? Before video conferencing was the norm, and there was a little bit more talk about virtual reality as an avenue that would become more woven into the fabric of learning and corporate learning. And my thought was, and sort of remains, that when a mature version of VR supporting learning would really be me putting on the helmet, the whatever science fiction looking gear it is, and having the feeling that I am in a room with people, as opposed to, again, interacting just with my 2-dimensional screen. And that feeling I actually has maybe just been reinforced by the experiences that we've had in more virtual instructor-led and this type of format, where, you're right. It does, the engagement's not the same, the dynamic's not the same. Even, I've joked about this, that as much as we try to simulate some things in a virtual environment by sending people off to breakout rooms, for example, right? But those breakout rooms you send people off to, you go off to them and then you come back to the main room and you're just with the big group again, as opposed to being at a table where, yes, you have a conversation, but then you're still at the same table with the same people, where you might be having some sidebars. And it's no one in a live classroom tells folks, okay, well, we're going to get up and go to our breakout groups and then come back and sit down auditorium style and just toggle back and forth between those two things. But that's what most live virtual learning is, right? And it's not quite the same. It's not quite the same, which is not to say that it can't be effective. There can't be effective digital designs, but I think we're still working out a lot of the mechanics of how to compensate for that.
One of the things that I personally think is one of our best is when you've got a blended solution, like, because the reality is that people still need to connect virtually. That's just the nature of the way things are now. So if you can get the best of both worlds, and it does require investment, of course it does, but the value from it is I was having this conversation just the other day with some participants on one of our programs who had come to where our Impact's headquarters is in the Lake District in the UK. And again, like they've got that benefit of being face to face with their peers in the same room, in the same building. But then they can go away and connect with those people on the platforms that they, like you said, and have those still meaningful connections, but in a way that has been enhanced by being in the same physical space as them. And they were talking about I sort of interviewed them there, and they were saying about that value of that physical face-to-face connection and how it's just and I think we're, and particularly since 2020, of course, the value of it started to, people go, oh, it's okay, we can connect on Zoom and things like that, but really we're seeing it come back now where it's like, actually no, we do need to be seeing each other in physical reality again.
I don't want to seem like I'm overstating what I do for a living or over-indexing it or anything, but can you imagine feeling comfortable going to a doctor who tells you, I just went to a virtual medical school, right? Until you feel fully comfortable with that, then we should also be questioning the level of comfort we have with saying that anything is done in a purely virtual way, right? Yeah,
it's so true. Right, I did what I said I wouldn't do, which was to take us vastly off topic. But we did stay on topic because it does lead us nicely into our next question, which is around motivation. So, if leaders want to keep their teams motivated during constant change, what would you say is one behaviour that they should start modelling right now?
Yeah, this is kind of a recent observation, but the thing that I've seen a lot of struggling with is that with change comes new challenge, new responsibilities, new things to get done, new tasks, and what people seem afraid to do, or at least hesitant to do, is say to their own manager, what can I deprioritize? You're asking me to prioritize this thing as a result of this change, and I need to know what I can deprioritize in order to achieve it. And again, a very simple sounding thing, but this is again, part of the observation is just from coaching that I've been doing recently, and had a few folks who I think are very, very understanding, very empathetic toward the teams that they lead, but were wondering why people were feeling stressed out and overburdened. And that became the question. Well, because they felt like people in their teams did have the latitude to deprioritize. And I would say, is that explicit, or are you saying that because you feel like you've established that as a cultural norm? And the answer has quite often been cultural norm. And when I've said, well, how about you go back and check on that? They have come back and said, you know what, actually, it turns out that while I was very open to that, I had never articulated that in a clear enough way. Or, to your point, Dan, role modeled it, right? Where just saying as a leader, hey, we've been asked to make this pivot. As a result, I am deprioritizing this thing because we are still one team. I am still one person. And I do think that's a huge factor in change, is just underestimating the extent to which it causes people's priorities to be thrown into some disarray, and then helping them reprioritize. So that's at least one thing that's been on my mind lately.
I like what you're saying about the role modeling there. We often echo behaviors that we see. Yeah. And so, and again, that in itself is can be quite the act of leadership, where if going, right, well, the teams aren't behaving the way that they, I'd kind of like them to act or behave in certain situations. And yet if they're seeing from that leader behaviors that the sort of the bad behaviors, let's call them, that they're trying, then you just, do as I say, not as I do type of.
That's it. Yeah.
And so to kind of notice that, and that is a key thing of like the noticing part of that is you, as soon as you start to do that, then you can make some changes to try and influence the team around you. Yeah,
culture is what they say. It's what you tolerate and what you role model, right? Mm-hmm. And so some of this is just taking the subtext that you may have assumed and making it text, so that it's not just an assumption. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Well, in that case, then let's sort of summarize a bit of what we've talked about already. And we've talked about the role modeling, and a good leader can always be learning. But what would you say is good learning? What does good learning design look like? What do you think we should continue to reinforce so that the solution remains rigorous and focused on delivering real business impact?
Yeah, and of course the real business impact part of that comes back then to knowing what it is that you're measuring, what your outcomes, your behavioral outcomes would be. But in terms of good learning design, then I do have kind of a one-word answer to this, which is just reflection. And I've come, it's fun. Years ago, I built out a little bit of a rubric for my team saying, hey, these are the things that actually promote learning and durable learning and application of learning, and nothing we should do should deviate from these 5 things, right? And I want every product we create to be one where I can point to a random page and say, why this activity, why this thing, what's the learning principle that supports doing this thing at this time, right? And then realized that, and those 5 things are pretty well known and basic. It's just spaced repetition, retrieval practice, again, social learning, reinforcement, and problem solving, right? But all of those require the one thing that it's been hammered into my head a little more over the last few years is the value of reflection. We don't learn by doing. That's a little bit of a myth as well. We learn by doing and then reflecting on it. If I do a YouTube video to help me change a tire, I can do it, but unless I actually think about it later on, I am no more equipped to change a tire without watching a YouTube video than I was before, right? So that reflection piece is just enormous. And it comes back to, again, are you setting context for why you want people to behave differently, right? Because leadership development is always going to be about behaving differently, not just being different, as we said at the beginning. And so part of the reflection is helping people reflect on this behavior and the context in which I'm exhibiting this behavior. And so that's part of the way in which I challenge myself and my team, is to go back and say, listen, the attention deficiency, as the saying goes, doesn't just run in my family, it gallops, right? And I have as much proclivity to it as anyone. So I'm very easily the person who stands up in front of the room and says, all right, let's think about this for a minute. Cool, good minute, let's go, right? And now I actually have a little music, instrumental music trigger that I put into presentations to make sure that I don't rush people through reflecting. But that's just so much a part of it, is the making sure that we step back, think about the context, think about our, visualize ourselves doing the thing that we're doing. And then again, we are, our obligation as learning practitioners is to, as I said, ensure that anything we point to can be pegged to what's the learning science that supports this design decision here. And on top of that, since reflection is underpinning all of this, Are we providing enough opportunity for, and the right tools for reflection, right? So that people can reflect in a guided way, so that they've got the right equipment, in a manner of speaking, to help them say, okay, what does this mean for me in my own context, in my own practice?
Well, I'm sure everybody from Impact listening to this will be thinking that you work for us, because, of course, the reflection piece is part of our experiential learning model as well. And you're right, it's so true that, embedding reflection into your day-to-day is key, I think. In fact, we had another podcast episode a few months ago, which we'll shamelessly put a link in. We kind of looked at some tips for reflection, and one of which was, even if you were to just try, where possible, to pack up 15 minutes earlier than you would do normally, and just dedicate that time at the end of the day to kind of reflect and just make some notes on the day, even if it's just a case of like itemizing what happened in that day to try and get you into that mindset of reflection. But I wonder if you've got any other top tips of what you might do, apart from to give it slightly more than 10 seconds. When you've set a minute for reflection, what is it you do? Oh, you mentioned about a musical trigger.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
Well, that's something I do in programs to ensure that I don't rush through or rush people through the reflection process, right? Okay. So I will put on very gentle instrumental music. I have it embedded in slides and everything, and just say, this is just so that I don't rush you through. So either you're going to be just listening very deeply to this music for a minute, or you can use the minute to do the reflection that's going to make this worth the time that you just spent on whatever learning activity we just did, right? And it's
a great
funny
tip though, because if you've got a particular piece of music that you can have on in the background, not necessarily focus in on, but then that's giving you 3.5 minutes of reflection time because you've got to the end of the song. Yeah, it's a nice tip.
It's been helpful for me, as I said, with my terminal impatience. Because I don't want to shortchange people, and because it's very easy, and certainly early on in my career, I found it super easy to fall into the trap of, our goal is to get through this content and do these exercises, and no, the goal is not about your checklist. It's about people learning and walking away, being able to do something differently, apply something differently, think differently. And when you flip it that way, again, whatever techniques help you to make sure that you're protecting the reflection and the depth of conversations and things that happen along the way, so much the better.
Yeah, no, it's great. For me, one of my preferred methods of reflecting is, and I don't do it often enough, but is usually when I'm either commuting or in particular on a bike ride. I've processed so much by that, because you're not distracted by anything, especially not technology. You've got at least a good amount of time to actually process some stuff. Plus, your mind can wander. The blood's pumping through the body, and it kind of so that exercise bit, I'm sure a lot of people use exercise as a way of reflecting as well. It's harder to do that in the middle of a work day if it doesn't allow, but or at the end of every meeting, it's not as easy.
But I agree with you, and it ties very closely to the old cliche, but it's a cliche because it's quite true. The shower, right? The thoughts occurring to you in a shower, and a lot of that is a function. And there's actually some interesting research on why we get more creative or we have good ideas when taking a shower. It's part because it's multisensory, among other things. But that's another. Like, I think we do it almost unconsciously, except now many of us are, putting our waterproof earbuds in or something, and maybe not using that time to reflect in a way that we would have in the past. So that's another one for people to think about.
Definitely. Excellent. Well, I've got one sort of main question for you left, and then we'll finish off with our question that we ask all of our guests as a moment of reflection at the end. So we've kind of touched on it a bit already, but you've worked in a variety of different organizations and sectors in your career. What would you say is something that you've seen consistently drive innovation across different teams or organizations?
And so a couple of things on this. One is that expertise matters, and I think sometimes I find there's a little bit of a trap that teams or folks fall into, where there's an idea of, well, just you get the most almost naive view of things, or it's all about creativity, and innovation and creativity, right, are not the same thing. There's a body of expertise, and when you look at even serial entrepreneurs who have come up with very different products or business models, they also immerse themselves very deeply into whatever it is that their next project is going to be. And so I do think there's a certain amount of rigor and research and expertise that in the better organizations, there's just a great deal of respect for that, right? And then you can have creativity on top of that. I say the example, Jackson Pollock, Georgia O'Keeffe, Norman Rockwell, Mark Rothko, they all went, those are artists, painters with wildly different styles, but they all went to the same art school and got the same basics before they went off and did their own very different things. And I think there's an important lesson in that. And so that's part of it. I also, it's funny that there's a little bit of a cliched answer to that question that most of us in leadership development would give, which is not wrong, and that's psychological safety, right? This idea that I am not punished for sharing different ideas or for trying things and failing. The one and Amy Edmondson, who famously coined that term, even she has said she doesn't love the term itself because it implies a little squishiness, and it's not about being squishy. It's about being very accountable, pressure testing ideas, but just not feeling that there's a sense of embarrassment if the ideas don't hold up, right? Yeah. But the one thing about that is I know. I think there's been a little bit of a thing that's grown out from the idea of psychological safety, which is this as a concept, which is this like, oh, learn from failure. Learning from failure is an important way to learn, and I think that is a trope that doesn't really account for the fullness of human emotion or experience. We hate to fail, so promoting failure gets a lot of clicks. I think it sells some books, but in the real world, there are guardrails that need to be around that. I think that we don't always account for, and so. By the way, we learn, there's good research that says, yes, we do learn very well from failure, but not our own. We learn from the failures of others and those around us, right? Yeah. And so I think there's something to this as well, just in terms of the companies that innovate do have cultures of psychological safety where people feel empowered to try things, but that don't go all the way to this, like, oh, let's just celebrate every failure, throw stuff against the wall and see what sticks. That's actually not a great recipe for innovation. Undergirding it with strong expertise, and then letting the ideas flow from there. That's I think a more productive environment.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminded me of something that a university lecturer used to say to me. Well, us. And it was around the phrase trial and error. He hated the phrase trial and error, and instead he would call it trial and development. So it and it's true. it's kind of the way and it's interesting. Like even the word failure, it's sort of reframe failure as learning opportunities, or it's it's interesting because I suppose in any creative process, there's got to be space for failure, but it's how you're right. It's kind of like, it is how you engage with it, I suppose, isn't it?
Self-development theory establishes mastery as one of the core components of human motivation, right? And it's absolutely at the heart of game design, and so. You're undercutting it when you make failure the goal in and of itself, right? And so framing that in a way that accounts for people's need to feel strong in certain ways, to feel masterful in certain ways. That's it's a little bit of a mental wrestling match, but an important one.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's it's good. Listen, we've reached the end of our time together, I'm afraid to say, but I do have one final, I know it goes fast. We do have one final question for you before we let you get back to your day, which is a question we ask all of our guests. And it is a bit of a, as we've talked about, it's a bit of a time for reflection. So if you were able to have a conversation with your younger self, what would be, say you were starting your career again, what would be the best piece of advice you'd give your younger self?
I know y'all said not to think too much in advance about any of these, but this one I end up thinking about anyway. So I did spend some time, and some of it is stuff that's already come up. The idea I was not, in my mind, science oriented enough or research oriented enough in my earlier days. I was not necessarily as thoughtful about measurement as I would like to have been. But when I think maybe one thing that I would have at least wanted to prepare myself for was, and it comes back again to that thing that context matters, but that for a leadership development practitioner in particular, maturity matters, and I do mean that, and maturity including the sense of experience, right? Where in my earlier days, and partly because I want to be so guided by science and good practice, I would say, well, does it, if I understand principles of good leadership practice, does it matter how much that I have personally used those principles, or does it matter how much I've experienced if these are still the quote unquote right things? And the answer, I didn't appreciate it at the time, but the answer is yes, it does matter. I realize, and I remember it hitting me like a lightning bolt when my right-hand person at the NBA left, and I, as a result, had to step in and go back to leading some workshops for newer managers, and realized within a day that I was not as well equipped to do that as I had been in the past, because my experience had just evolved so much that I was not really coming from the same contextual space that they were in. And that doesn't mean that it can't be done, but I certainly wasn't as prepared for it as I should have been. And the flip of that was I would get so frustrated, as I said, with the idea that, well, why can't I work with senior leaders? Why can't I help them to understand some of the ways, and it, maybe again, this is an AI thing where no one's going to listen to the person who hasn't led a team, who hasn't gone through some of the struggles in order to get here, just as they wouldn't necessarily listen to an AI saying, here's how you should do things differently, right? But I've needed the experience. I've had to have, as was not true at one time, having one lousy boss at one point. And if they're listening today, I hope you've improved. But even having a lousy boss mattered, and that wasn't true at one point. But just the body of experience to draw on, and then making that part of a human connection. Because as I said, becoming a better leader does require some changing of your thinking, and it's hard to prompt that if you're not making a human connection with someone. And so I think that's probably the thing I would have said to myself, is just be patient, you're going to have to earn the right to be in front of a room with more senior leaders and talking to them about leadership. And you'll get there, buddy, but it's, no one is wrong for telling you that you need to be patient right now.
Yeah, that's interesting, because what I'm in some ways hearing is that actually there's not much you would change, because everything you've learned, you've got there in some way, shape or form anyway. And we have, I think that's, so I think it's almost the being patient with yourself, isn't it? It's the not necessarily patient with others. I think that's been fascinating to kind of hear that.
Yeah, it's a little. There's a little butterfly effect thing here where I worry if I gave myself some advice, I might end up in a different place, and I like where I've ended up. But yeah, patience with self matters. Yeah,
yeah, for sure. And do you think you are patient enough with yourself still, or do you still?
You know what? I do think I am. I will say maybe 80% of the time, which is a pretty. It's been a good linear progression up to that. There's it's definitely peaked recently. So yeah, I think over time I've gotten more patient with myself.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, listen, Mike, thank you ever so much for giving us your time today. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day to be with us and to chat with us. That's sadly all we've got time for. But thank you. It's been great.
My pleasure. No, it has been great. Thank you, Dan. It's really been a fun conversation.
Amazing. Well, that just leaves me to say that if you'd like to find out anything more about Impact, or if you might want to see some of the work that Mike's been doing, or if you wanted to look back at some of our previous episodes, don't forget, we've got all the links that you need for everything in the description of where you found today's episode. So thank you one more time to Mike for joining me today. Thank you, Mike.
My pleasure.
And until the next time, take care.